I thought she was taking me out for lunch. 2 hours later, I was standing in a cold, unfamiliar hallway, and she was gone. But what she didn't realize was that I still held the one thing that could change everything. I remember the exact moment when everything changed. It was a Monday morning, the kind of dull, grey morning you get in early November here in Leeds. The kind where the cold seems to seep into your bones before you even open the window. I was sitting in my little kitchen, wearing my wool cardigan, the one with the patched elbow and the missing button, the one Margaret used to nag me about. My kettle had just boiled, and I poured myself a cup of Earl Grey, letting the steam rise into my face like a quiet comfort. The house was silent, as usual. No phone calls, no visitors, just the sound of the wind rattling the windows and the occasional creak of the old floorboards under my slippers. But I didn't mind. At 82, peace was a luxury. My world had shrunk to the walls of that little house, the garden I could no longer tend, and the framed photographs that lined the mantelpiece, frozen memories of people who'd moved on with their lives. Emily was one of them. My granddaughter, my only granddaughter, in fact, a bright girl, always had been. Big dreams, big eyes full of ambition. I raised her like my own after her mother. My daughter Ruth passed away far too young. I held her tiny hand through grief. I helped with her homework when no one else had the time. I watched her grow into a young woman who knew how to smile at a crowd but rarely looked anyone in the eye for long. She hadn't visited in months. A few texts here and there, promises of next week or after this project. I stopped expecting anything. That way, I wouldn't feel the sting of disappointment. But that morning, something different happened. A knock at the door. It startled me. No one knocked anymore. I stood up slowly, knees aching, and shuffled to the front. When I opened the door, there she was, Emily, in her beige trench coat, hair neatly tied, holding her phone in one hand and car keys in the other. "Grandpa," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I thought I'd take you out for lunch today." I blinked, surprised. Lunch? Yes, something warm, a proper Sunday roast, maybe. It's been too long. I didn't argue. Something in her tone made it feel less like an invitation and more like a command. Still, the idea of being in a restaurant, eating something that hadn't come from a tin, was oddly exciting. "Let me grab my coat," I said, my voice cracking slightly from lack of use. "No need," she replied, stepping inside and picking up my walking stick. "I'll help you to the car. It's warm enough." Warm enough. It was barely 6 degrees out, but I didn't protest. We got into her car, a sleek black BMW that smelled like leather and expensive perfume. I noticed she hadn't brought a handbag, just her phone. Strange for a lunch outing. The roads were quiet as we drove through the familiar streets. I watched the buildings go by. The park where I used to push Emily on the swings. The corner shop where Margaret and I used to argue over biscuits. I smiled to myself, clutching the cane between my knees. But something felt ... off. We didn't turn toward the city centre. Instead, Emily took the bypass, the long road that leads out of Leeds and into the more rural side of town. "Where are we going?" I asked, turning to look at her. She kept her eyes on the road. "Just somewhere nicer. It's a surprise." I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. Emily had never been good at surprises. They were usually for her benefit, not mine. The silence in the car grew heavier. She tapped her fingers against the steering wheel. I tried to make conversation, asked her how work was going, if she was still with that fellow from Manchester. She gave short, polite answers, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. Then I saw it. The sign, St. Mary's Residential Care, welcoming your loved ones with dignity. I blinked. Surely not. Surely this wasn't what I thought it was. But as she slowed the car and turned into the long driveway, the truth hit me like cold water. This wasn't lunch. This wasn't a visit. This was a one-way trip. The building loomed ahead, red brick with ivy crawling up the sides, like a house trying to hide its own secrets. There were flower beds at the front, benches, a nurse wheeling someone along the path. From a distance, it looked almost pleasant. Emily parked the car and turned to me with that same tight smile. "This place is nice, Grandpa," she said. "They have activities, good food, medical staff. You'll be taken care of." I stared at her, unable to speak. "I've already signed the forms," she added, pulling out a folder from the glove compartment. "They're expecting you." That was when I understood. This wasn't a discussion. It was done. I was being dropped off like a parcel. No explanation, No goodbye dinner, not even a conversation, just a decision made behind my back, delivered with a forced smile and cold efficiency. "But why?" I finally managed to ask. My voice sounded hollow. She hesitated. "You live alone, it's not safe, and I don't have time to check in on you all the time. This is better for both of us, better for her," she meant. I knew it. Deep down, I'd always known Emily was pragmatic to a fault, but I never thought she'd do this. She opened her door and got out. I followed slowly, knees trembling more from shock than age. As we approached the front entrance, a nurse greeted us with a clipboard and a plastic smile. "Mr. Jonathan Ward, welcome to St. Mary's." Jonathan Ward, my name, but it didn't feel like me anymore. Emily handed her the documents and looked at me with eyes that were already somewhere else. "I'll visit soon," she said, kissing my forehead like I was a child. And then she walked away, just like that. No turning back, no guilt, no hesitation. I stood there, holding my cane, staring at the car as it disappeared down the drive. The wind blew sharply through the trees, and the doors of St. Mary's closed behind me with a quiet finality that felt like the end of a story. But what Emily didn't know, what she could never have imagined, was that this was only the beginning. The sound of the doors closing behind me echoed louder than I expected. It was soft, polite, automatic even, but in my ears it sounded like the final snap of a book being shut. Like someone had finished writing the last chapter of my life without asking me if I was done living it. The nurse who greeted me, her name was Janet, I would later learn, had kind eyes and a warm voice, but there was something rehearsed in her tone, like she had said the same phrases to 100 others. "We'll get you settled in, Mr. Ward. Your room is all ready." I nodded, not trusting my voice. My throat still burned from the few words I'd forced out in the car. My mind was stuck on Emily's face. That calm, distant expression, like this was just an errand she had to get through before going back to her real life. The walk to my room felt longer than it should have. My legs ached. My cane tapped the polished linoleum floor in a rhythm I hated. The hallway smelled like lemon disinfectant and old curtains. We passed other residents, some in wheelchairs, some slowly shuffling like me, some staring blankly out of windows. No one spoke. When we arrived at room 213, Janet opened the door and smiled. "Here we are. Fresh sheets, private bathroom, and a lovely view of the garden." I stepped inside. The room was clean. That's the first word that came to mind. Not cozy, not warm, just clean. Beige walls, a single bed with stiff white linens, a wardrobe, a desk, and a small armchair by the window. My suitcase was already there, the one Emily must have packed. I hadn't noticed it in the car. I stood in the middle of the room, unsure of what to do. I didn't sit, I didn't speak. Janet patted my arm. "Dinner's at 5. The nurse will come by later for your meds. If you need anything, just press the red button on the wall." "Okay," I nodded again. She gave me one more smile and left. And that was it. No orientation, no warm welcome. Just a quiet drop-off into a place where time moved differently, slower, heavier, more suffocating. The silence afterward was unbearable. I sat in that armchair for what felt like hours, just listening to the clock ticking, to distant voices in the hallway, to the occasional rustle of trees through the double-glazed window. I kept waiting for the sound of Emily's car coming back, a change of heart, a knock at the door, something, but nothing came. Dinner was served at exactly 5 o'clock. I shuffled to the dining hall, where I was placed at a table with 3 other residents, all older than me, it seemed. No one introduced themselves. We ate in near silence. Mashed potatoes, overcooked peas, and dry roast beef. I forced it down, nodding politely when someone looked my way. Later that night, back in my room, I opened the suitcase. Inside were some clothes, a framed photo of Emily and me from when she graduated university, a shaving kit, and my slippers. That was all. No books, no letters, no keepsakes, no soul. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the photo. She was smiling in it, genuinely, her arms wrapped around me, cap and gown still on, her eyes filled with light. That was the girl I knew, the girl I loved like my own child. Where had she gone? Sleep didn't come easily. The bed was too firm, the room too quiet, and my heart too loud. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the drive over, her voice, her calmness, the sharp turn down the country road. I didn't cry. I wanted to, desperately, but something in me had turned to stone. The days blurred together. They fed us 3 times a day. Breakfast at 8, lunch at noon, dinner at 5. A nurse came in the morning to check my blood pressure and hand me a cup with 2 pills I didn't recognize. I asked what they were for. "Just part of your wellness program," she said with a smile. I nodded, but I didn't take them. Not yet. I kept to myself most days. I'd walk slowly down the hallways, sit by the window in the common room, or stare out at the garden below. Occasionally, someone would try to make small talk, mostly staff. The other residents seemed like ghosts of themselves, floating from one place to another, waiting for, I don't even know what. Emily didn't call. She didn't visit, not even a text. My birthday came and went. No card, no message, not even a call. That hurt more than anything. I thought maybe she was busy, maybe something had come up, but I knew the truth. She had moved on. She had left me here because it was easier than dealing with me, easier than hearing me talk about the past or ask questions about her future. I was no longer part of her plans. One afternoon, I overheard a nurse talking on the phone. She mentioned a man whose daughter had moved into his house before he even left. Something twisted in my gut. Had Emily done the same? I tried calling my home phone. It went straight to voicemail. I called again the next day. Still nothing. That was when I realized I had no control over anything anymore. They had me, not in chains, but in silence, in routine, in medication I didn't ask for, and meals I didn't enjoy. But I wasn't dead yet. Despite everything, the silence, the hurt, the slow decay of my dignity, something inside me stayed alive, a flicker, a stubborn little flame that refused to go out. I started writing again. Late at night, when the nurses thought I was asleep, I'd pull out an old notebook and scribble down thoughts, memories, details, conversations. I wrote about my life, about my mistakes, about Margaret. I wrote about Ruth and how proud she would have been of Emily. And I wrote about Emily, the girl she used to be, and the woman she had become. I also wrote down everything I remembered about my accounts, my assets, the trust I'd set up years ago, the things I never told Emily or anyone else, just in case. One night, I sat by the window and watched the lights in the garden flicker on. A nurse, the one from Belfast, I later learned was named Carol, was helping another resident with a blanket. She looked up at me and smiled. Something in that smile reminded me I wasn't completely invisible. I waved. She waved back, and just like that, the silence cracked. Just a little, but enough. Enough to remind me that the story wasn't over. Not yet. I first noticed Nurse Carol about 2 weeks after I arrived at St. Mary's, while most of the staff moved like clockwork, in and out of rooms, heads down, smiles on autopilot. Carol was different. She didn't just do her job. She paid attention. She saw things. It began with small gestures. She'd linger a few extra seconds in my room during the morning rounds, straighten a picture frame that was slightly off, ask if I wanted honey instead of sugar in my tea. Nothing extraordinary, really, but in a place like this, where time moved, like molasses and kindness was rationed, those little things became significant. One morning, as she was checking my blood pressure, she glanced at the notebook I kept on my desk. It was black leather bound, old, worn at the edges. I always made sure to close it when anyone came in, not because it held secrets I was ashamed of, but because it was all I had left that was mine. "You write a lot," she said, not noisily, just gently. "Poetry." I chuckled. "Not quite. Just thoughts. Pieces of memory, mostly. May I ask, are they for someone?" I paused. It was a fair question. "No," I said slowly. "They're for me, and maybe for someone who might care one day." She didn't press further, just nodded, and said, "That's good. It's important to keep the mind moving, especially in places like this." Places like this. She understood. That told me everything I needed to know about her. Later that day, I saw her again in the common room. I was reading a book I'd borrowed from the facility's tiny library, a crinkled copy of A Tale of Two Cities, when she came over during her break. "Mr. Ward," she said, "may I sit for a minute?" I nodded, motioning to the empty chair beside me. She sat with a cup of tea and glanced at the cover of my book, Dickens' classic. My dad used to read that to me when I was little. He said it was the only book that made him cry. "That final line gets most people," I said. "It is a far, far better thing than I do. You know the rest." She smiled. "Yes, and it still gives me chills." That was the first real conversation I'd had in weeks. Not just with her, with anyone. No forced pleasantries, no checklists, no pills or meal schedules. Just two people sharing words over a quiet moment. After that day, Carol made it a habit to check in when she could. Not just medically, but personally. She'd ask what I was writing, what I remembered from my youth, whether I'd ever been in love more than once, whether I believed people changed as they grew older, or just revealed more of who they'd always been. It felt strange, opening up. I hadn't talked about those things in years. But with her, it was easy, natural. One afternoon, as we were talking in the garden, a rare moment of sun breaking through the grey, she asked a question that changed the tone entirely. "If you don't mind me asking, Mr. Ward, what did you do before retiring?" I looked at her, not suspiciously, just carefully. I hadn't told anyone here. Not because it was a secret, but because no one had ever cared enough to ask. "I was in real estate," I said finally. "Property acquisition, mostly. I started small fixer-uppers, 1 or 2 bedroom homes. Then I expanded." She raised her eyebrows slightly. "Sounds impressive." It was, I admitted. At one point, I owned over a dozen buildings across West Yorkshire, most of them rental properties. A couple of small commercial lots. Carol whistled under her breath. "That's quite a bit more than I expected. You don't exactly carry yourself like a man with a real estate empire." "I never liked to show it," I said with a shrug. "Besides, Margaret used to say that the quieter a man is about his wealth, the longer it lasts." She smiled at that. Wise woman, she was, I replied, my voice softening. Far wiser than me. There was a silence between us, the kind that doesn't need filling. Then she asked, "Do your family know about all that? The properties, I mean?" I laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Not exactly. And so, slowly, carefully, I told her the truth. The story I had never told anyone. Years ago, after Margaret passed and Emily's father, my son-in-law, started sniffing around my finances, I moved most of my holdings into a private trust. It was something Margaret and I had discussed often, how family can change when money enters the equation. We'd seen it happen with friends, with siblings. One day they were close, the next they were fighting over who got the china cabinet. I didn't want that for Emily, or for me. So I did what any stubborn old fool would do. I hid things in plain sight. Created a trust under the name of a shell company. Transferred property titles. Locked up key documents in a secure deposit box in London. Only one lawyer knew the full extent. Mr. Bernard Hill, an old friend from my RAF days, who went on to become a solicitor. I never told Emily, not because I didn't trust her at least, not at first, but because I wanted her to build her own life, not wait for mine to end. But over the years, I noticed changes. She grew colder, more calculating. She stopped asking how I was, and started asking what I had. When she brought up the idea of simplifying things, offering to take care of the house, I saw the same glint in her eye that I'd seen in her father's years ago. So I smiled, nodded, and quietly moved everything out of reach. Now, sitting in that garden with Carol, I told her everything. The trust, the assets, the clause that would trigger if I were declared mentally incompetent or placed in long-term care against my will. She listened without interrupting, her brow furrowed, her tea forgotten. "Does she know?" Carol asked softly. "No," I said. "She thinks I'm just an old man with a fading mind and a tired memory. She thinks she put me away and took control. But she doesn't know I was 10 steps ahead." Carol leaned back in her chair, visibly impressed. "You're a lot sharper than people give you credit for, Mr. Ward." "Please," I said with a small smile, "call me Jonathan." From that day on, Carol became more than a nurse. She became my confidant, my friend. She began helping me organize my notes. I dictated letters, and she typed them up on the nurse's office computer. After hours, we drafted a message to Bernard Hill, requesting activation of the trust clause. "Are you sure?" she asked me one night. "Once this goes into motion, things could get messy." I looked her in the eyes. "She left me here without a second thought," I said. "She assumed I was powerless. But she forgot one small detail." Carol finished the sentence for me. "You're not." And for the first time in months, I smiled. Not the kind you give to hide your pain, but the kind that comes when you know something is about to change. There are things you carry to the grave, or at least, that's what I used to believe. I had every intention of taking my secrets with me, quietly buried alongside my name. in a modest cemetery in Yorkshire. No headlines, no inheritance squabbles, no vultures circling before the body cooled. Just a clean, quiet departure from a world I had given everything to, a world that no longer had room for men like me. But the day Emily signed those papers and left me in St. Mary's, something shifted. She didn't just abandon me, she underestimated me. And that, as I've learned over nearly 8 decades of life, is the first mistake of anyone who believes they hold power over someone else. You see, the thing about secrets, real secrets, is that they require patience, and I had plenty of that. After Margaret passed, I spent years watching the cracks in my family deepen. Small betrayals disguised as concern, invitations forgotten, birthdays missed, conversations that ended with, "We'll call you soon, Dad," and never did. So, quietly, I began building something no one could touch. The trust back. In 1994, I met a man named Bernard Hill through a veterans charity fundraiser in Leeds. He was a solicitor, clean-shaven, sharp as a blade, and completely disillusioned with the legal system. We hit it off. He had stories, I had scars. Over time, we built something stronger than friendship, trust. It was Bernard who first suggested the idea of the protective trust. I still remember the way he explained it to me over pints of bitter ale. "If you want to protect your assets from greedy hands, Jonathan," he said, "you don't just write a will. You build a fortress, and then you bury the keys where no one thinks to look." I took his advice more literally than he expected. Over the course of 6 years, I transferred my properties into the name of a holding company, registered in the Cayman Islands. Then that company became the sole asset of a trust, the Ward Preservation Trust, established under Bermuda law, and with an ironclad clause: in the event that Jonathan Arthur Ward is placed into institutional care under conditions he has not expressly approved, or is declared mentally incompetent by any family member with financial interest in his estate, all power of access and inheritance is suspended indefinitely. The trust shall activate autonomous preservation, monitored by legal proxy, and reassessed only at the directive of the primary trustee. In simpler terms, if someone tried to force my hand or tuck me away in a care home, they'd lose everything. But I didn't stop there. I wrote letters, dozens of them. One for Emily, not the one she'd receive if I passed peacefully, but the one I left with Bernard, sealed with wax and bitterness. In it, I didn't lash out, I simply told the truth. I reminded her of the girl who once held my hand on a cliffside in Cornwall and whispered, "Don't ever leave me behind, Grandpa." Then I reminded her that she did exactly that. There was a letter for her children, to my grandchildren, who hadn't visited me since I fell and broke my hip in 2022. I wrote to them not as punishment, but as a mirror. I wanted them to see what their absence had cost, not in money, but in meaning. I wrote a separate one for the local paper in Yorkshire, to be released only if certain legal thresholds were triggered. That letter contained everything: names, dates, the full scope of what was taken and what was protected. It wasn't blackmail, it was legacy. The safe deposit box in a bank just off Trafalgar Square, under the name Arthur W. Harding, a pseudonym I borrowed from my mother's side, sat a safe deposit box containing originals of every deed, transfer, and legal document tied to the trust. Inside was also a USB drive, encrypted. It contained recordings, me speaking into a tiny microphone over the course of several months, documenting every step, every betrayal, every moment. I felt the walls close in. It was my voice, my evidence, my final argument in case I didn't live long enough to see the plan unfold. The activation nurse Carol helped send the activation letter to Bernard. She walked 10 blocks to a private courier on her day off, disguised as sending a parcel to her sister in Kent. Within 4 days, Bernard responded with a simple message: "Understood. Activation protocol initiated. No further contact necessary until phase 2. That's when I knew it was happening. The ripples begin a week later. Emily visited. It had been nearly 2 months since she dropped me off. I was in the common area, playing chess with Mr. Patterson, a former history teacher who only spoke in quotes from Churchill. I saw her before she saw me. Same tailored coat, same phone glued to her palm, same impatient walk. She barely looked round the room before locking eyes with me. "Dad," she said, "we need to talk." The staff gave us privacy in the side lounge. She didn't sit. "I tried to access your accounts last week," she began. "They're frozen, every single one." I kept my face blank. That's strange, I said. You said you weren't interested in my finances. She ignored the jab. And the house I went to the estate agent, and they said the deed wasn't even in your name anymore, that it hadn't been for years. Oh yes, I nodded. I forgot to mention that. Her voice raised, brittle. Dad, what the hell is going on? I leaned forward slightly. What's going on? I said softly. Is that I gave you the benefit of the doubt. I trusted that you'd respect my wishes, that you'd care for me, not control me, but you made your choice. She stared at me, stunned, and then she said something that revealed more than she realized. This isn't fair. I need access. You don't understand what kind of financial pressure I'm under. Ah, there it was. The truth beneath the concern. The hunger beneath the hug. I do understand, I said. That's why I did what I did. She didn't stay long after that. The quiet satisfaction after she left. I sat in my room and reread one of my letters. It wasn't the one to Emily. It was the one to Margaret. Yes, I wrote to her too. Sometimes I imagine her reading it wherever she is, smiling that half smile she always gave when I managed to outwit someone who thought they had the upper hand. In the letter, I told her that I kept my promise, that I protected our legacy, not for wealth's sake, but for dignity's, that I remembered what she said in 1983 after her sister died, penniless and alone. If they ever try to put you somewhere like that, John, make sure they don't get the silver too. She was right. They tried, but they didn't get the silver. I used to believe that real change happened slowly, like the shifting of tides or the weathering of stone. But I was wrong. Some changes come in a single day. One moment, you're invisible, forgotten in a corner of the world. The next, your name echoes in hallways you were never supposed to walk again. For me, that day began with a letter. Not one I wrote, but one that was written about me. The article of the morning began like any other at St. Mary's. Cold toast, weak tea, Mr. Patterson mumbling about Rommel's tactics in North Africa, a nurse humming Danny Boy in the corridor. But then Nurse Carol slipped something under my tray, a folded piece of newspaper from the Yorkshire Times. She didn't say a word, just gave me that knowing look she'd mastered equal parts mischief and justice. I unfolded it. The headline read, "Retired veteran disinherits family after forced institutionalization." The quiet war of Jonathan Ward. My breath caught in my throat. There it was, my story. Names changed, of course, but the bones were mine. The betrayal, the trust, the claws. Even the quiet recordings I'd left behind were mentioned, paraphrased, but unmistakably mine. I could feel the air shift around me. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a burden in a beige room. I felt like a man again, a person again. Someone who hadn't gone quietly into that grey institutional dusk. Someone who had fought back. Emily's visit part 2. She arrived 2 hours later. No phone in hand this time. No coat. Her hair was a mess. Her face pale. She didn't ask for privacy this time. She didn't need to. The entire room hushed as she walked in. Not because they recognized her, but because they'd all read the same paper. Because everyone had seen. She approached my seat slowly. I didn't stand. "Did you do this?" she asked, voice trembling. "I did," I replied, without hesitation. Tears welled in her eyes. Not sorrow, not really. Something between humiliation and panic. She sat across from me, as if by muscle memory. "I've had calls," she whispered. "People from work, friends, Mum's side of the family. They're asking what I did, asking if it's true." I didn't respond. I let the silence speak for me. "I could lose everything," she said. "Do you want that?" "No," I said calmly. "I wanted a birthday card, a phone call, a conversation that didn't end with you trying to sign me away like an old sofa." She blinked. "You made me a monster." I leaned forward, voice low. "No, Emily, you made yourself one." I just turned on the lights so the rest of the world could see. The public turned within days. The story spread. From regional coverage to national curiosity. The grandfather clause, some tabloids called it. Pundits debated morality, ethics, elder rights. Solicitors called Bernard for consultations. Radio shows mentioned it with mock indignation. Some of it made me laugh. One morning I even heard a nurse whisper, "That's him, the one who fooled his whole family and took them down with a clause." It wasn't joy that filled me though. It was something quieter, like justice exhaling. The apologies begin 3 days later. I received a card from my youngest grandson, Thomas, We hadn't spoken since he was 11. He was 23 now, studying engineering in Bristol. The card was clumsy, handwritten in block letters. Dear Grandpa, I didn't know all this happened. I'm sorry. I hope we can talk sometime. Tom. I stared at that card for a long while. Maybe he meant it, maybe not. But it felt like a beginning, or at least an acknowledgement that something had ended. Bernard's second letter 1 week after the article went viral. A courier arrived at St. Mary's with a sealed envelope addressed to me. Inside was a single sheet from Bernard. Per your wishes, Phase 2 is now active. The properties will be placed under rotating charitable usage unless otherwise requested. Any family inquiry will be redirected. Your position as primary trustee is now fully protected under Article 14. I hope you're enjoying the view from the top. Old friend. BHI smiled. Phase 2. That was the part no one expected, not even Emily. What is Phase 2? It wasn't about punishment, not really. Phase 2 was about redemption, reclamation, the properties, the house in Leeds, the cabin in Northumberland, the flat in Edinburgh weren't going to be sold or left to rot. They were to become temporary housing for veterans, displaced seniors, and single mothers starting over. Each home with a plaque at the entrance, in memory of Margaret Ward, a life lived with dignity. I didn't want my legacy to be a pile of money fought over by people who'd forgotten my favorite song or the name of my dog. I wanted it to mean something, to matter to someone who needed it. And I wanted Emily to see it and know she couldn't stop it. The unexpected ally one afternoon, as the story cooled down and the world found a new headline, I was surprised to see a familiar face at the entrance of St. Mary's. Thomas, my grandson. He looked older than I remembered, taller, with tired eyes. But there he was, carrying a small box. We sat outside under the oak tree I loved. I brought you something, he said. Photos. From Mum's attic. Thought you'd want to see them. Inside were pictures I hadn't seen in decades. Margaret in her wedding dress. Emily as a baby asleep on my chest. A family barbecue in '89. I choked up. I don't remember you being this thoughtful, I said, half joking. He shrugged. Maybe I wasn't, but I want to be now. We talked for hours. Not about the trust. Not about inheritance. Just about life. The real victory as the sun set that day. I realized something deeper than revenge had happened. I hadn't just protected what was mine. I'd woken them up, forced them to look at themselves, to confront who they'd become, to decide whether they would keep going down that road or turn around and try again. Some never would, but Thomas, maybe he already had, and maybe that's enough. There comes a point in every story when the noise fades. The world stops watching, and you're left with nothing but your own breath and the quiet ticking of time. I had made my stand. The clause was executed. My story was published. The public outrage had come and gone. Emily had been exposed, and Thomas, my grandson, had begun visiting me regularly. But despite all this, I still found myself alone in that beige room at St. Mary's. That's when I knew I had one move left to make. One move, not for revenge, not for pride, but for me. The mirror every morning. There's a moment when I look in the mirror before anyone else wakes up. Not long, just a glance, enough to see if the man staring back at me still resembles the man I once was. That morning he looked tired, but at peace, and I realized something. I wasn't meant to die in this place. Not like this. Not surrounded by silent strangers and laminated schedules. Not under the smell of antiseptic and faded wallpaper. I had been a father, a soldier, a husband. I had traveled, I had built, I had loved. My final chapter shouldn't be written in a facility designed for waiting. It needed to be written out there in the wind, in the road, in motion. So I made a plan. The discharge leaving wasn't difficult, not legally, anyway. Bernard had arranged full guardianship only in the case of medical incompetence, and I was far from that. My memory was still sharp, my mind still clear. Physically, I needed help, but not confinement. So with a quiet signature and one final nod to Nurse Carol, I discharged myself from St. Mary's one rainy Wednesday morning. No announcement, no goodbye party. Just one packed bag and a black cab waiting at the entrance. Carol hugged me before I stepped in. "Where will you go?" she whispered. "Somewhere quiet," I replied. "Somewhere green." The cottage in Wales. I ended up in a small stone cottage in Snowdonia, North Wales, a place Margaret and I once visited when we were first married. It wasn't much. 1 floor, 2 rooms, and a fireplace that smoked if you weren't careful. But it overlooked a valley of pine and heather, and when the wind howled, it sounded like the hills were singing. I spent my days reading, writing, cooking simple meals, watching the mist crawl over the ridges like a living thing. There were no visitors, no gossip, no cries from confused patients in the night, just the quiet and my thoughts. For the first time in years, I rested. Letters never sent at night. I began writing letters I never intended to mail. To Emily, about the first time I held her hand when she was born. To Thomas, about the time he fell from a tree and I carried him home on my back. To Margaret, about how I still see her in my dreams. These letters filled pages, dozens of them, not for revenge, not even for forgiveness. They were just memories, fragments, pieces of me that I didn't want to vanish without being named. They're now sealed in a box by the fireplace, marked for eyes that still remember. Maybe one day, Thomas will find them, maybe not, but they exist, and that matters. The visit 2 months into my self-imposed exile, I heard a knock at the door. It was Thomas. He didn't say much, just smiled, held up a bag of groceries, and stepped inside like it was the most natural thing in the world. We cooked dinner together, chicken and potatoes. He asked about the army. I asked about his girlfriend. We laughed. We argued about music. We drank whiskey by the fire. He never asked why I left, and I never asked how he found me. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he came. The legacy in the 3rd month, I received a package from Bernard. Inside was a book, hardcover, glossy, beautifully printed. The title, The Grandfather Clause, a true story of family, betrayal, and quiet justice. He'd turned my ordeal into a book. I flipped through the pages with trembling hands. Photos of my old home, quotes from my voice recordings, legal commentary, even a chapter dedicated to the moral question of who owes whom in aging societies. At first, I was furious. I hadn't asked for this, hadn't given permission. But then I reached the dedication page, to Jonathan Ward, who reminded us that silence isn't the same as surrender. I wept, not because of the recognition, but because someone understood. The final move. I'm writing this now, on the last page of a leather-bound journal Thomas gave me. My hands shake more than they used to. My vision flickers. I don't know how many days I have left, maybe hundreds, maybe 5. But I know this. I made my last move not to punish, but to reclaim my story, my dignity, my right to be more than a forgotten elder in a silent room. My Netta may have put me in a home without warning, thinking I'd fade quietly, like wallpaper, but I didn't fade. I roared, and now I rest. Epilogue. The bench. There's a bench outside the cottage that faces the valley. Sometimes, when the mist clears, you can see the world stretch out for miles. I sit there most evenings, wrapped in a heavy blanket, sipping tea. Sometimes Thomas joins me, sometimes I'm alone. But either way, I smile. Because I know, truly know, that I didn't just survive what they did to me. I transformed it, and that is a legacy worth